Live right now and all the
If any of you have jumped on our live stream already, thank you. We're just going to wait a couple minutes to see who else jumps on before we get things rolling here. I think we'll jump into things. I never know how long to wait, and I always feel a little awkward sitting here in silence, knowing that someone somewhere might just be watching me sitting here in silence. So for anyone who has joined us, or for those watching this later after it's been posted, this is another live edition of Talk It Out. Joining me this evening is Shawn O'Grady. I will flip things over to Shawn, so you can further introduce yourself.
Hi, Megs. Yeah, happy to be here. So I'm a therapist working in Calgary and surrounding area. I do some individual and family therapy, and have a contract with Child Protective Services here in the area, as well of sort of child protection in Southern Alberta. Do some teaching and training. Oh, I think my dogs are fighting under my chair here, which I can lock them if they're not going to stop. I apologize. And yeah, and so I have kind of connected with the Do More Ag group and yourself, and have really enjoyed that. I mean, as I've mentioned on past calls, a lot of it I think goes back to my rural Eastern Ontario roots of growing up and working on farms and the kind of dairy farming community of the Thousand Islands. And yeah, and so it's nice to be here with different group of people that is talking about some important information that's certainly near and dear to me, both personally and professionally. So I'm happy to be here and add any knowledge or input that I can offer this evening.
And we definitely appreciate you joining us tonight, and all the other occasions that you have helped out as well. So for those of you who have caught some of our videos this month, or maybe some of you that haven't, our topic for the month has been severe brain injury and brain trauma. And so we're just going to kind of have a live chat about that tonight. If anyone wants to throw questions into the chat, feel free to do that. We can address those. Otherwise, Shawn and I are just going to kind of have a conversation about brain injury and what that can look like, what recovery can look like, what that can do on the mental health side, and just some of the important pieces to learn there. I guess we'll just jump in. Maybe, I know when you did your video, you did a really great kind of intro to like what brain injury and traumatic brain injury can be. If you want to kind of take us through that again as well.
Sure, and yeah, hopefully the video was. I find what's great about the neurosciences and the ever evolving world of brain science and brain research is that there are really smart people that have done an amazing job of who are much smarter than me, I should add, who have done an amazing job of being able to better appreciate and sort of describe our brains to us. I mean, and it's very evolving, certainly in anything I read, that what we're talking about in July of 2023 may alter and shift a little bit as they continue to do, MRI scanning, and certainly learning more about brain functioning, brain capacity. And so it's really exciting, I think, that we have the neuroscience world has dumbed it down for people like me to better understand, and then hopefully to be able to provide a little information to help. And so some of the basic concepts I would suggest would be that the brains are built from the bottom up and the inside out, and there's a real interconnectivity to our brains. And so if we look at the very lower part of our brain, I mean, you'd use the fist analogy, which would sort of be down here, it would be our brain stem. And so that's something we don't want there to be a whole lot of this concept of neuroplasticity, but we don't want that part of our brain to change. It's responsible for regulating our heart, our blood pressure, all of our autonomic sort of, aspects of the thing that basically keeps us alive and functioning and breathing humans. And so the brainstem is obviously the first aspect of the brain to develop, and happens sort of in utero, and then and obviously when we're born with that. And then the brain develops more into midbrain. Some of the referencing would be diencephalon and limbic system. So those aspects of the brain are much more responsible for emotional awareness, relational connections, the ability to sense and understand danger, processing related processes in terms of what's happening for us inside our body, and sending signals both downwards and upwards. And then the top part, and so if we're following along my fist, we're talking about the top part, or the cortex, or the neocortex, would be the part of our brain that's the most plastic, meaning it can change, and it can take previously stored information and apply it to current situations. It helps us think futuristically. It's the part we want access to, when we're having our children learn in school. Reading and writing and math and science is all our prefrontal or our neocortex that's working away. But back to that, connectivity. And so what we don't want is the cortex to be too far disconnected from our midbrain or our brain stem. And when that happens, it can be what's called flipping our lid. And so if you see people in traffic sometimes that are yelling and, beeping their horns and driving aggressively, or giving each other the finger, or all those sorts of road rage things, that would probably be, I would say, a pretty common example of when the cortex and the midbrain are too far apart and not regulating each other, and someone's kind of flipped their lid. And certainly when we root that in brain injury, there's various pathways and connectivity. And so if there's been an injury or some sort of an event or incident, it really can start to create a bit of a traffic jam. Or if you think of our cortex as an air traffic control, sometimes a brain injury or an event can create lots of confusion. And so if you can imagine airplanes trying to land, I'm in Calgary, so trying to land on the Calgary airstrip with no air traffic controller telling people when to land and when to not land, it can create a lot of chaos. And so I think that's probably an oversimplified, but hopefully a helpful version to what may happen when there's brain impact or traumatic brain injury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is helpful. And I think, to your point, we are still learning so much. I think back to when I was a competitive diver, when I was like 13 years old, how concussions were dealt with at that point, very different from how we deal with them now. And that's can be on the more minor side, right? But even just with that, you can have that confusion that maybe only lasts 12 hours or 24 hours, or maybe lasts longer. Or you can be on the other end where, we talked to Curtis, and he shared his story where he's 22 years out from his bull riding injury and his brain injury, and he's still recreating those pathways and those connections to be able to do, new things that he couldn't do the year before or the week before.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's such a good point, Megs, is this idea that neurons that fire together wire together. And so we know that the best way to help people through would be pattern repetitive neuroactivation, right? And so the way to help people recover from any sort of event or injury, and that can be on the mental health side as well, right? As if we're trying to deal with anxiety or depressive episodes or other sorts of, recurring and intrusive impacts in our brain, this idea that we need neural repetitive, pattern repetitive activation. And there's some really great, again, sensory-based interventions and sort of self-regulatory strategies that we can use to help us better regulate, because it is a very individual experience. Like you say, you might have somebody that experiences some temporary, confusion, dizziness, and maybe some nausea, and then someone else who it has become perhaps a lifelong or debilitating experience for them over years and years of time, to some of our people who we would look at more end of life, where when you think about the concept of dementia and how that starts to have a long-term and in some ways irreversible brain impact and causes forgetfulness, memory loss, changes in behavior, confusion, aggressive responses. And so that to me, I suppose, would be another aspect of traumatic brain injury as well.
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever looked at dementia as a traumatic brain injury, but I mean, technically it is, right? It's that breakdown of those pathways and the pieces speaking to each other.
Yeah, I think anytime, and I might be, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but to me, it's important to think about that it impacts so many different groups of people in so many different ways. The brain is an amazing, it's the most amazing organ, and really unbelievably and remarkable in what it can do. But anytime it's altered or it's at some level of disadvantage or impairment, I think it makes it strikingly clear how reliant we are on our brains for functioning. And so any kind of impact or any sort of temporary or longer term impairment, I think, can create some real negative social, psychological, and physical, consequences for people and their families, obviously, and friends as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And, some of the either podcasts I've listened to or people that I've spoken with that have had brain injuries, they talk about some of the feelings of depression they can have afterwards, or some of those feelings of kind of isolation and anxiety. And you really highlighted in our last talk how often one of the things that is, prescribed right at the beginning is to be in more of that quiet, dark, isolated space, because the brain can't be overstimulated, and that can be kind of too much or set back the progress that has been made so far. And so just, how does somebody maybe support someone that has, is in their life that's had a brain injury that has been, recommended to really kind of be in that dark, quiet place without letting that person feel like they're alone? And
yeah, I think that's I remember us talking about that, and it's so true. Is the prescription for recovery is the thing that we would say leads to significant depressive and isolating experiences. And so you get it on the physical, it's the same thing, in a different context, but kind of what we were doing with COVID strategy, right? It's like we are creatures that crave human and relational connection, and the strategy was the best way through this is to completely isolate and disengage from. And so we, those of us were, doing some work in the mental health field at that time, which we're talking about, okay, be physically distant, but still be socially connected. And I think the same is true for this. One of the probably most important moments in my career as a therapist was to realize that it's not my job, nor do people want me to solve their problems. And in fact, when I do that, I run the risk of being arrogant. I run the risk of oversimplifying somebody's situation. And sadly, I think we, naturally as humans want people to feel better. And so I think the thing that's probably most challenging is if we were to go and sit with somebody in a dark area who might feel really agitated and pissed off and not feel like talking about how things are going to get better, or it's all the cliches, this too shall pass. Like, I think there is a power to just sitting with somebody and bearing witness to their pain, and not needing to change that, and not needing to tell them it's going to be better, because it may not be, and so I think it's about being relationally present and connected with somebody, without feeling like it's our job to solve their problems, or run the risk of oversimplifying that, oh, this is going to be okay, or the things that we do, in my experience, people that have shared the things that make them the most pissed off about grief and loss is all the cliches, right? Of they talk to them about, oh, that have you thought about dating again, when they're grieving the loss of a marriage, or and again, it comes from a good place, but it just totally minimizes someone's experience, and so I think that's something I'm really mindful of, is bearing witness to people's pain without feeling like it's my role to try to magically or sort of superficially take that pain away. I think that's probably a transferable strategy of how we might be able to sit with somebody, and it might require some preparation because that's hard, right? And so if this is your own family member, or this is a friend you care about, and you see them in a struggle, it's almost, how do we prepare to maybe not do the things that might, cause this person to go, I don't ever want them to stop by again, because, I know they're trying to be helpful, but it actually made it way worse in the process,
Yeah, that's a good point, especially if that's like a family member that, there's multiple people in the house, and that dynamic of, how do we support this person without making it worse? And just like you said, bearing witness to what they're going through, and being there, which is for sure challenging when we want to fix everything. One of the things that Curtis shared too was very much that, as someone is recovering, especially from a traumatic and severe brain injury, where maybe they're needing to learn to walk again and talk again and do all of those things again, to recreate those pathways, that don't assume they can't do something. Like, let them try, and let them know that you're there to help if they need it, but let them try first, and don't just come in being like, oh, like, I'll get the wheelchair, or I'll sign that piece of paper for you, or I'll do whatever. Like, let that person try, and let them, in doing that, take some control back over what's going on in their life.
Yeah. Brene Brown talks about that. She's got a really thick Texas accent, but she's a brilliant woman in the field of mental health. And she has a really great video, I think, on maybe one of the TED Talks or a YouTube. I mean, it's easily findable. But she talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy, which is, I think, exactly what you're saying. Is you can have, be empathic and be caring and compassionate towards somebody, but to be sympathetic is just, oh, you poor thing, let me do this because we know you can't possibly do it yourself, and that is a distinctly different experience. And in therapy school, it's very, when you got to do your sort of someone calling in behind the mirror telling you how badly you've just screwed up the question you've asked to a family or something. Those are, I think, some of the common pitfalls that as humans we run into, which is, blurring or confusing empathy and sympathy. I think is a common, well-intended, yet for maybe somebody like Curtis, maybe a real triggering experience, or perhaps taking his agency away, or sort of, starting to, unintentionally, assume he's not resilient in this particular situation.
I think too, one of the things that we haven't touched on is that with recovery, and this is, mental health, this is, with self-care, we all have to find what works for us, but especially with trying to come back from something and working to come back, that it is a day-by-day thing. And sometimes there are setbacks, and to not think that that is necessarily, a full setback, but it's just part of the process, especially with the brain trying to heal and rewire. And I think how everyone goes through something is different. So you never know, and no one knows how that process is going to go for an individual. So just trying to kind of keep those pieces in mind if someone or yourself is trying to recover.
Yeah, such a good point. And I don't know, your hair is much less gray as mine is, and so you may not, but I used to think like The Price is Right had this game called the Yodeler, where it would sort of go up a cliff, and if you didn't bid the right number, this thing would fall off a cliff. So when I was learning about development or child development, that is probably an image that I had, is that when we're developing or improving or gaining, it's always this straight climb up a mountain. And in fact, it was only in the last 10 years or so where I really learned that development is actually peaks and valleys, and so for parents out there who see regression in their kids and go, oh my God, they're falling. We actually, usually regression happens just before somebody takes another step or another climb. We sort of dip down. And I think the recovery strategy is the same from a brain injury, is that usually we may fall apart a little bit or regress a little bit. And that might be the thing that happens just before we take another step. And so not to, get jaded about that if possible, or not to catastrophize someone's temporary regression, because that in fact may be the strongest indicator that they're about to take another step in their development or progress.
Yeah, I like that imagery. It's almost like you're pausing to recharge or to recover before you kind of take that next push forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. And I think much more of an accurate way than this kind of, I think we want to view the world as linear, right? That it's that it just moves in a steady, point A to point B. And that's, I just think that's pretty incompatible with what true development and recovery is.
Mm-hmm. Are there, for anyone out there watching, are there kind of key places to go to for more information on kind of the brain injury side of things? Or we haven't talked about, I know we did in the video, but I feel like, again, we're talking mental health. You and I are going to be very supportive of people connecting to mental health professionals. But I think that, what we've talked about, especially knowing that those feelings of depression, anxiety can come from the recovery or come from the injury itself, just the importance of talking to someone. Anyone is always better than nobody, but talking to a professional as well, and maybe someone who knows a little more about brain trauma and injury.
You bet. Well, I think certainly the stigma is real, right? I think both you and I could probably think of our own personal, people that we know, or perhaps even ourselves at times in our life where I'll just keep this to myself and I'll shut down, I won't assume that on you, but I'll certainly talk about my own pitfalls.
I've done it.
In regards to that. There has been some great brain research, particularly related to brain injury. I mean, the NFL, sadly, I think due to really negative consequences, has invested, lots and lots of financial, money into some great research hospitals in the US. Certainly the Hotchkiss Center, even here in locally where I am, the Brain Research Center based out of the University of Calgary in the foothills, some great research and information that's coming out of there. And I think really all across the country, I think, Mount Sinai out of Toronto has done some really great work in that area as well. And so if you were doing more independent research, I think it's always safe to connect it to hospitals. The Mayo Clinic, I would say, out of the US would be another, because we know then that it's credible. And I always worry about, Google search warriors, and it's always terrifying, the stuff that you can, find. Not that Google isn't helpful. Not picking a fight with them like our federal government is currently, but I just worry when it's not peer reviewed. What I mean? Meaning that other kind of researchers and scientists haven't taken a look at this, and I just worry about how that can steer people, unintentionally down a path. And so I think the brain research that's being done within universities and hospitals in North America is really, really strong. And then from that, I think mental health professionals have an awareness, and most of us have been required to do some more brain and trauma-based training. And ethically, those of us that don't have an appropriate amount of knowledge have an ethical responsibility to say, hey, you know what, this isn't my area of specialty or expertise, but I could recommend you to, what I mean? And so I do think there's a reasonably safe aspect there, where those of us that are licensed professionals within the country do have an ethical obligation that if we don't have good knowledge about something, that I would have an ethical responsibility to refer that person in a different direction. So hopefully those would be a couple of, ideas or resources. And I think, again, the last 20 years been some really powerful, advancement and lots of, I think, former athletes too, that have donated their brains to have them studied around, CTE and better understanding traumatic brain injury as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm just gonna put a shameless plug out for Ag Talk. So we have our own peer-to-peer support platform that's now national for anyone who's connected to agriculture, working, living, playing in the industry. It's free, it's fully anonymous, it's available 24/7. It looks like Facebook or Reddit timeline, and you can post anonymously about what you're going through, what you're struggling with, or go there to support other people. But that could be a great place for, yeah, if you've gone through something and you're just looking to connect to others, and it is monitored by clinicians too. So if there is, wanting to have that conversation with a mental health professional, they're there to support as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, it's such a great website and platform, and I've spun on there a couple of times recently, and I think it's really wonderful what a great initiative, and trying to move the mental health and just, I think, health and wellness in general forward for the ag industry is, I think, fabulous. So yeah,
Thanks. And
wholeheartedly agree.
before we go, I want to also touch on something we haven't touched on yet. We're talking traumatic brain injury. So I think we'd be remiss to not talk about safety when it comes to brains. And I can speak from experience as a, living on farm, former farmer, that we don't often think about safety on farm with our brains the way we would think about brain safety if we're in the city. So if I was going to rent ATVs, I would have to wear a helmet. There's a good chance I'm not wearing one on farm. Same with growing up riding a horse. I never wore a helmet. But now if I was to put my kids on a horse, I'd probably make them wear helmets to begin with. So just, biking on farm, starting to have some of that awareness too, that, it is really easy to injure your brain. Sure, there are accidents that happen. I've had a run-in with a combine ladder that obviously I was not going to have a helmet on, but, when you're able to, bump up that layer of protection, especially with children, to make sure that that's kind of coming into your thought process of how do we, farm safety isn't just about, being seen and making sure that equipment's safe moving around the yard. It's also how do we protect our brains.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of prevention, right? Because I mean, there are the, and I didn't hear Curtis's video, but I will certainly check it out, because I would imagine when you hear some of the painful stories of people's encounter with brain injury, I think it would behoove all of us to do anything. Not that everything's 100% preventable, but even if we can reduce the potential by, what I mean. And it's funny, I skate in the mornings here in Calgary with some guys, and even now the Zamboni drivers wearing like helmets when they're driving out onto the
Wow.
ice. And so I was like, I was actually thinking of that based on our last conversation that we had, where I was like, I noticed it. I'm like, oh, and yeah. So imagine, right, if you were to slip off a Zamboni and your landing spot is 1.5 feet of solid ice. If a helmet's going to, reduce the potential of a long-term consequence, it just, to me, makes so much good sense. And I agree when you think about the unintentional hazards that are there for equipment and the livestock and all of the the equipment and the ladders and the climbing and those sorts of things. I think it just does make good sense, helmets, but also probably harnesses and bungee cords and things when we're up on, like, I'd rather hang in the air for
Yeah.
And feel uncomfortable in various regions of my body for a few minutes than maybe to tumble down onto the ground and to have some sort of, because I think we've both just talked to people that have explained the long and arduous process of trying to come back from serious concussions and or other brain injuries, for sure.
Yeah. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you wanted to touch on before we let everyone get back to their summer adventures?
I mean, probably, and I think you've alluded to it, but probably just patience, right? That idea that it is an individual experience for people, and so to avoid the urge to think that it's going to look a certain way, and so that I think everyone's recovery is pretty individual. I think there's ways we can show up and support people that isn't about needing to solve their problem or take the pain away, despite how much we would like to. And I think sometimes being prepared for some of the common reactions to brain injury, which is increased impulse control problems anger and, mood swings, irritability, difficulty tolerating, social situations, sensitivity to light. Because I think sadly we may unintentionally judge people that this person is, that someone's choosing to act this way, or that's, and I really believe people do well if they can, right? And so if a person's not doing well, let's assume that there's some legitimate reason, i.e. some sort of a brain and or maybe mental health or, emotional regulation challenge that's going on for them, that I rarely, and I mean, I've worked in child protection for 25 years, and rarely have I met someone that gets out of bed in the morning and says, I can't wait to destroy all my relationships. I can't wait to, struggle with substance abuse problems. I can't wait to not be a good parent or a brother or sister or, a son or daughter. But yet those things happen, right? And so I think sometimes it doesn't mean we don't want people to be accountable and to get the help they need. But I think having that patience and that understanding that sometimes it's a pretty low and slow and winding road, and to not try to maybe cheat the process too much as someone's trying to work their way back. And but at the same time, recognizing that that may also mean that we need boundaries, right? That we need to set our own boundaries as somebody's recovering, if those typical symptoms are there, irritability or lack of impulse control and mood swings and aggressive behavior. We can support somebody without putting ourselves at risk by choosing to be, in a space with them that may not be safe because of what they're going through. So I think both can be true at the same time.
Yeah, those are all really good points. Thank you for wrapping up with that. For everyone that joined us today, thank you so much for your time. For those of you that watch this later, again, thank you. If you're looking to learn more about mental health and agriculture, to get connected to resources or to Ag Talk, please visit our website, which is domore.ag.